Good morning, and good morning, Lewis. Good morning, the world. And what I want to talk about today, in fact, is a world topic, which is DNA, the molecule that all life forms are based upon. I'm afraid I'm not joined today by Phil Meredith, the Madge to my Dame Edna Everage, because he purports to have no knowledge of the subject. I don't think that's true. I think he's just gone for a deep wax, to be honest. Anyway, DNA. I've spoken to Keith about this and said this is what I'd like to talk about, and it sounds a bit dry. I promise you it's not. It is of interest to all lawyers, but it starts back in the early 50s with Crick and Watson, and in fact the massively important Rosalind Franklin, who had a really important impact on what they were able to achieve and was never in her lifetime properly recognized, sadly. So I want to name check her. She's a very important person in DNA. And you may be aware that DNA, they found, was constructed of two helixes. So in other words, two bits of molecule or molecules that wrapped around each other like a spring almost. And it has revolutionized a range of subjects. And it's having an important impact on the topic that I like. Well, I'm not sure I like it necessarily, but it pays my mortgage, which is the law. And the early days of DNA in the law were very limited. And the reason I've spoken, I want to speak to you about this, is you may remember, if you saw the last meeting I had with Phil, he was talking about how DNA solved the Cardiff 3 case. And it did. And it did to the advantage of people who were wrongly convicted. And it has a very important role nowadays in criminal investigations. So you get cases like that where you can go back and say, sorry, you've got the wrong person. There is also a DNA database. And if you were to get arrested, I'm not suggesting you were, Keith might be, I don't know. I'm not going to represent him, I can tell you that now. If you were to get arrested and there was an issue about the science, then it's probable they would take what's called a buccal swab, which is it's like a cotton bud in the side of your mouth in your cheek, and you have to rub it on the inside of your cheek, and then they put it in a sealed container and get your DNA from that. Found not to have committed offence or found not guilty, you are entitled to have that destroyed, and that's typically what happens. But there is a database of people who have been convicted, and therefore their DNA is on a database. And when an offence is committed that involves some form of scientific evidence, it's possible to go back and look at that database and check against it. Now, I'm going to get on a little hobby horse of mine now, if you don't mind, which is this, is that people always talk about forensics. Forensic, in fact, means of or pertaining to, in other words, relating to evidence. So a forensic scientist is a scientist who deals with giving evidence. A forensic pathologist is a specialist pathologist who deals with cutting up bodies and then giving evidence in court about what happened. There are many of them, a forensic psychiatrist, for example. Now, so what we should do is we talk about the science, we shouldn't talk about the forensics. That's a misnomer. And as my family would tell you, I am rather a stickler for the right language, sometimes possibly pedantry, I don't know. Anyway, DNA. It's made great strides since the days of Franklin, Crick, and Watson. But in particular, in relation to the field of investigation, the science has made a number of changes in recent years. It started with what was called STR14. That's where they would take 14 points on the DNA and check those, because it was deemed statistically by mathematicians that if you had 14 points that were the same for a given person and a given sample, then that was sufficient to prove guilt. That's probably right, in fact, if truth be told. They also take one just to check the sex of the person whose DNA it is. That's a different thing. But they've improved that. Now they have what's called STR17. They do exactly the same process, but there they have 17 different checks. And typically, in cases that I do, the evidence from a scientist about a link between a sample that's been taken and a person, and you can well imagine these are very often intimate samples that are taken. Typically, it's 1 in a billion. Now, that does mean that there are 8 billion people in the world. I suppose it does mean that there might be another 7 who are running around in China or India who have the same DNA, but it's extremely unlikely. There are 2 other forms of DNA testing that can be done. They cost a little bit more. They're very much more special. Spoken as bog standard. Before I tell you specialist ones, let me say about the bog standard ones. Don't bother with those things about what's my background. Send me a DNA test to find out what my is. No, that's frankly. But the 2 others are YSTR. Now, the Y it's the male chromosome. X means female. You could actually trace through their male line, and so it's only women don't have that. And it's called mitochondrial DNA, which is the bit that remember years ago there was a finding of a called Lucy, so a pre-human. It was said that her mitochondrial DNA linked to humans, and it probably did, and it got, to say, first woman. It wasn't, because there would have been thousands of other. But nowadays, what we can do, though, importantly, is we can trace somebody's male line, and we can also trace somebody's female line. Or the way. It's been useful in lots of cases that I've done, as I've said. In fact, end up with a match that's 1 in a billion between a swab that's been taken from somebody who is and compared to the defendant. And 1 in a billion, of course, makes it for the doc, because how are you going to disprove that? You can some kind of contention, failure to deal with the process, with brilliantly, and you rarely, if ever, get those arguments. Unlike prosecutor, and sometimes you just have to your client. We can't tell him. But I wanted to talk to you about a couple of cases in what I've done. May not be. I might or might not. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think that. First was about a rape. Years ago now, got into a lot of trouble for saying that there are different types of rape. I don't